My name is Claire Donovan. I am 21 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I wanted to believe my parents would be there when it mattered most. Growing up, I was the quiet one, the overlooked one, but I thought deep down that if my life was ever on the line, they would finally choose me. The night of the crash proved me wrong. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and when I woke up in a hospital bed fighting for breath, I learned my parents had been notified. They were told I might not survive the night. And still they did not come. Their reason was something I could never have imagined, something that cut deeper than any injury. They chose my sister's dog instead. From that moment forward, I knew my story was no longer just about survival. It was about uncovering why the people who should have loved me most turned their backs in the darkest hour. Stay with me, because what followed will take you from the silence of a hospital room to revelations that no family can escape, and the truth will leave you questioning what loyalty really means. Everything I thought I knew about family shattered the same night my windshield did, metal screaming, then nothing. That was the last sound in my head before the world split apart. The car jolted my body, snapped forward, my shoulder belt locked against my chest, and my ribs felt like they cracked all at once. Headlights flashed across the windshield, blinding and white, then a deafening crash sent glass exploding in every direction. The car spun, metal shrieked, tires skidded across slick pavement, and for a few unbearable seconds, gravity meant nothing. I tried to scream, but it never made it past my throat. Rain, glass, steel, then silence. A suffocating black silence that swallowed me whole. When I came back, it was not to the rain or the road. It was to a sterile brightness that felt like another world. The ceiling above me was too white, the lights too harsh, humming faintly with that electrical buzz hospitals always have. My chest rose unevenly, each breath punctuated by a machine beeping at my side, slow, steady, almost mocking me for still clinging to life. I couldn't move. My body was pinned not by wreckage anymore, but by pain. My skin felt raw, tight with bandages. My mouth was dry, and something foreign pressed deep into my throat. I realized a tube was keeping me alive, air forced into me, because I couldn't do it alone. My hands twitched, heavy with tape and needles tethered to bags, dripping clear liquid into my veins. Panic rose fast, crushing, but I had no voice to let it out. I tried to lift my head, and the attempt sent agony stabbing through the side of my skull. Warmth trailed from my temple, stitched tight and pulling with each tiny movement. My body felt less like flesh and more like shattered porcelain glued together by strangers. I closed my eyes, wishing I could drift back into the black where nothing hurt but voices cut through the haze. They were just outside my door. "It's heartbreaking," one woman whispered. She was critical when she came in. "We weren't sure she would make it through the night." Another voice, hushed but clear, answered. "We called her parents right away." I froze, every nerve in my battered body straining. "Do you know what they said?" The second nurse's tone cracked in disbelief. "They said they couldn't come." "Couldn't come?" The first nurse sounded horrified. "Yes." The answer fell heavy. "They said Alyssa had to walk her dog." The silence that followed hit harder than the impact of the crash. "Even when we told them she might not survive the night," the first nurse asked again, softer now, as if hoping she had heard wrong. "Even then," the second voice confirmed. "They said it was just bad timing." I felt my chest seize. Not from broken ribs or fractured bones, but from a truth sharper than any shard of glass lodged in me. My parents had been called. They had been told their daughter, their flesh and blood, might not live to see the morning. And they stayed home because Alyssa's golden retriever Daisy needed a walk. Tears pushed hot from the corners of my eyes. They slid down slowly, soaking into the pillow beneath my head. I had been through pain before, sickness before, disappointment before, but nothing ever sliced me open like those words. They chose the dog over their daughter. The thought echoed louder than the machines, louder than the rain still tapping faintly against the window. My mind tried to reject it, to twist it into something else. Maybe they misheard, maybe the nurse exaggerated, maybe it wasn't true. But no part of me could hold on to those excuses. The tone of those voices outside, the way sorrow clung to every syllable, left no room for doubt. Pain throbbed with every heartbeat. I shifted my head toward the narrow hospital window, ignoring the lightning bolt of agony shooting through my skull. Raindrops raced each other down the glass, blurred by my tears until the whole world outside looked like it was weeping too. I remembered that same rain an hour earlier pounding against the car roof, slicking the road until the tires lost their grip. I had been scared then, but it was the kind of fear that came from chaos. This fear was different. It was cold, heavy. The kind that came when you realized you were utterly alone. Machines beeped beside me. A monitor showed green lines climbing and falling, proving my body was still fighting, but inside me something cracked. I could feel it, the fracture that wasn't in bone or muscle, but somewhere deeper, somewhere no surgeon could repair. I thought of Alyssa, probably curled up on her plush white couch back home, scrolling through her phone while Daisy slept at her feet. I thought of my mother adjusting her glasses, nodding as Alyssa explained why she couldn't leave the dog alone. I thought of my father, too impatient to argue, just agreeing because it was easier. Every picture cut deeper. I tried to convince myself maybe they were waiting until I was stable. Maybe they thought I'd be okay. But the words echoed again, relentless. They knew she might not survive the night. And they chose the dog. I felt small in that bed, smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Not 21 years old, not a college student, not even a daughter. Just a body held together by stitches, ignored by the two people who should have been first to rush through those doors. The room blurred through tears, the edges dimming with medication and exhaustion. I wanted to scream, to rip out the tube, to demand someone call them again, but I didn't. What was the point? They had made their choice. The rain tapped harder against the window, a cruel rhythm keeping time with the monitor's beep. I closed my eyes and let the tears run freely, soaking the sheets under my head. Machines kept me alive, but they could not touch the wound that mattered most. My body could heal, my ribs could mend. But I knew in that moment the scar that would stay forever was the truth I had just heard. They chose the dog. They chose her. And they did not choose me. I let the thought settle, sharp and final, while the storm outside raged on and the sterile light above me hummed indifferently, as if none of it mattered. For me, though, it was the end of something I could never get back. I learned young what it meant to be second choice. The hospital bed reminded me of it, but the truth was it had been written into me long before the crash. My earliest memories were stitched together with small betrayals that felt normal at the time but carved me into someone who stopped expecting to be chosen. I was 7 in second grade when I fell from the monkey bars on the school playground. My arm bent at an angle no arm should bend, and I screamed until a teacher rushed over. She called my mom from the office, panic clear in her voice. I sat with an ice pack pressed to my wrist, crying so hard my vision blurred. When my mom finally answered, the teacher explained I needed the hospital right away. My mom's response carried across the phone line, flat and calm. "Can she wait an hour? Alyssa has dance rehearsal." The teacher looked at me with pity, like she knew she had no power to change it. So I sat in the nurse's office, arm throbbing, until nearly an hour later my mom appeared. Alyssa still in her tutu beside her, twirling, with no idea what I was going through. The doctor later said the delay made the swelling worse. I learned that day how to bite my tongue through pain and wait my turn. 2 years later came my 10th birthday. At school, I handed out the cupcakes. I begged to bake, smiling through the awkwardness when kids asked if I was having a party. At home that evening, my parents had decided one celebration was enough. Alyssa's birthday was only 2 weeks away, so they lumped us together. Alyssa had her own cake, white frosting piped with her name, pink candles shining just for her. I had to blow out hers too, leaning across the table to share the moment that should have been mine. My mother clapped loudly and told me to be grateful. The pictures from that night sit somewhere in an album, Alyssa grinning at the camera, while I hover in the corner of the frame, my smile small and strained. It kept happening. When Alyssa caught the flu, the whole house shifted into emergency mode. Towels heated in the dryer, soup simmering on the stove, Netflix marathons, while she lay bundled in soft blankets. When I came down with strep throat, my mother cracked my door open just enough to hand me cough drops. "Stay in your room," she said, "we can't all get sick." My fever climbed until sweat soaked my sheets, but no one came to check. Alyssa peeked in once, wrinkled her nose, then shut the door quickly as if my illness was an inconvenience. By middle school, I understood that attention had to be earned. I worked for it the only way I knew how, through grades. Straight A's lined my report cards. I carried them home, proud, heart pounding, hoping this would finally be enough. I set the paper in front of my dad, waiting for him to notice. He glanced down, barely pausing. "Well, of course you did," he said. "You don't really do anything else." Then he folded the paper and left it on the counter without another word. A week later, Alyssa came home with a C in math. She pouted, embarrassed, but my parents rallied around her. "You tried, that's what matters," my mom said warmly. That night, they handed her a brand new iPhone, still wrapped in plastic, as a reward for the effort. I sat across the table, my perfect report card already forgotten under a pile of mail. Moments like that built up in me. I carried them silently, hiding the sting behind a mask of obedience. I convinced myself it wasn't favoritism, just bad timing, or maybe I wasn't as lovable. So I made myself useful. I learned to cook dinner when my mom was tired from driving Alyssa to cheer practice. I volunteered to fold laundry, to help with groceries, to pick up the pieces no one else wanted. Every act was another silent plea to be seen. But nothing shifted. The pattern held. Alyssa was always the center. I was the background. I can still see one evening clear as glass. I was 13, lying on the couch with a pounding headache, stomach twisting from stress. My mom sat beside Alyssa, braiding her hair while Alyssa talked about her friends and upcoming dance recital. I whispered that my head hurt, that I felt dizzy. My mom barely turned. "Take some Advil," she said. Then she smiled at Alyssa, praising how shiny her hair looked. I sat there, invisible in my own home, while my scalp burned with the truth. No matter what I said or did, I was never the one who mattered. These memories crowded me in the hospital bed, stacking one on top of another until they crushed me under their weight. The accident had not created the distance between me and my parents. It only proved what had always been there. I realized that night in the ICU that the crash had stripped away the last veil. My parents did not come because I was not their priority. I had never been. From monkey bars to birthday cakes, from sick days to report cards, the truth had always been the same. I was not chosen. I was not the favorite. I was not even considered. That knowledge sank into me like ice water. It stiffened my spine, tightened my chest, and forced me to face what I had avoided for years. From the very beginning, I had never been the priority. Not once. And now, lying broken in a hospital bed, I finally saw it for what it was. I had never been chosen, never truly seen, never loved without condition. It was not the accident that carved the deepest scar. It was the pattern that stretched back over my entire life, a pattern that whispered the same truth over and over. From the time I was a child, I had never been the one. Morning bled through the blinds of the hospital window, a dull gray light that made everything look colder. My body ached in ways I didn't know were possible, every breath a reminder of ribs cracked like splintered wood. I had drifted in and out through the night, clinging to fragments of dreams that ended with the sound of screaming metal. When I opened my eyes for good, the room was quiet except for the beeping beside me and the soft shuffle of rubber soles on the floor. A nurse stepped in, the one I had seen most often. Her badge read Marissa Clark. She carried a clipboard, but when her eyes met mine, she smiled gently, as if trying to stitch me back together with kindness alone. She checked the monitors, adjusted the line in my arm, and then leaned closer. "You're stronger than anyone thought," she whispered, her tone calm but careful. "We didn't think you would make it through the first 48 hours. But you did." I wanted to answer, to thank her, but the tube in my throat turned every thought into silence. She seemed to understand because she laid a hand lightly on mine, grounding me in the moment. Her voice softened even more. "Your parents haven't called once." The words pressed harder against my chest than the bandages. My eyes burned, but I refused to let the tears fall this time. I had already drowned enough. Marissa lingered for a moment, then straightened, professional again, and slipped out the door. Later that afternoon, a man in a white coat came in, a folder tucked under his arm. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from too many lives in your hands at once. His badge read Dr. Samuel A. He introduced himself, though I already knew from the nurse's whispers who he was. He asked how I felt, shining a light in my eyes, pressing gently against my bandaged ribs. I grimaced at every touch but kept my silence because the tube still held me hostage. He set the folder on the tray table, flipping it open with the ease of routine. I couldn't see everything from my angle, but I caught the top of the page, my name typed in black letters. Below it, lines of notes times updates. He studied them and then sighed. His eyes lifted to meet mine, and something in them told me he carried a truth I was not ready to hear. "I want to be honest with you," he said slowly, almost as if speaking to someone who might break under the weight of the words. "When you came in, we contacted your parents immediately. It's standard procedure, of course." I waited, already knowing where this was going, but needing him to say it anyway. He hesitated, then continued. "They declined to come. The note here says." He turned the page slightly so I could see. My vision blurred, but I focused until the letters sharpened. "Parents notified, declined visit. Reason dog care." The words hit me like another collision. My stomach lurched, bile rising, but there was nowhere for it to go. The monitor beside me sped up, lines jagged and sharp. Dr. Lee reached out, steadying my arm. "Breathe slow," he urged, calm but firm. I tried forcing air through my lungs, but the truth had already lodged itself too deep. There it was in black and white, not whispered through a door or softened by pity. It was official, logged in a hospital record, permanent proof of my place in their lives. My parents had been given a choice between me and a leash, and they chose the leash. I closed my eyes, trying to escape the sight of those words. Memories of my childhood blurred against them like shadows, every moment of being overlooked, every dismissal, every time Alyssa was lifted high while I stood unseen. Now it was documented, undeniable part of my medical history. Dr. Lee's voice cut through. "I am sorry. I know that isn't easy to hear." I opened my eyes and looked at him. For once, I didn't feel the urge to excuse them or pretend it didn't hurt. There was nothing left to protect. My silence was my answer. He nodded gently as though he understood, then closed the folder and told me he would check on me later. When he left, the room seemed bigger and emptier than before. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks down the window, but I didn't look outside. I stared at the ceiling, each white tile a reminder of how small I was in this place, how disposable I had become to the people who should have been here first. I let the truth sink in, heavy and cold. There was no misunderstanding, no room for excuses. They had been called, they had been told their daughter's life was slipping through their hands. And they had chosen Alyssa's golden retriever over me. The anger came quietly, not in a burst, but in a slow burn that filled every corner of me. I had spent my life justifying them, believing if I tried harder they would see me. But now, staring at the ceiling with stitches pulling at my skin, I felt something inside, close off. I decided then, with more certainty than I had ever felt about anything, that if I survived this, if I walked out of this hospital, I would not walk back into their lives. The monitor beeped, steady, almost in rhythm with the vow I repeated silently. Never again. I turned my head toward the empty chair beside the bed, the place where a parent should have been. It stayed vacant, just like it always had, and I understood at last that it always would. The night before my discharge, I asked for paper. The nurse brought a thin notepad from the drawer of the bedside table, along with a pen that felt too heavy in my trembling hand. I stared at the blank page for a long time, listening to the hum of machines around me, the steady rhythm of the IV pump, the faint shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. The silence inside me was louder than all of it. I began to write, my fingers stiff, every letter scratching against the paper as if it resisted what I needed to say. I wrote their names first, my parents' names, and then I let the words spill. I reminded them of the call they received from this hospital the moment they were told their daughter's life was hanging by a thread. I told them I survived not because of their love, but because of strangers who cleaned my wounds, held my hand, and whispered encouragement while they stayed home. I described the sting of learning the reason they refused to come was because Alyssa's golden retriever Daisy needed care. I wrote about the log in the hospital record, how their choice had been documented forever. Each sentence carved deeper into me, but I could not stop. I wanted it written, undeniable, so that someday when they tried to twist the story, I could point to this letter and say this was the truth. At the bottom, I wrote the words that had haunted me since the nurse first whispered them. "You chose the dog over your daughter's life." My hand shook when I underlined it. I could barely read through the blur of my own tears, but the ink stood bold and final. I signed my name, pressing hard enough that the imprint went through to the next page. Then I folded it neatly, slid it back into the drawer, and closed it like sealing away a piece of myself. The nurse came in later with the discharge form. She smiled kindly, told me I was strong, that not everyone made it this far. I nodded, gripping the pen again to sign my name one last time on the hospital papers. My body still ached, ribs wrapped tight, stitches pulling with every breath, but I forced myself upright. Slowly, painfully, I removed the lines from my arm, the sensors from my chest. Each piece that detached felt like unhooking myself from the place that had kept me alive. I changed into the clothes folded at the bottom of the drawer, the same ones I had worn the night of the crash. They smelled faintly of smoke and rain, wrinkled and stiff, but they were mine. I packed what little I had into a small black case, the zipper catching halfway before sliding shut. I stared at it for a moment, realizing how little I carried after everything. Then I stepped out into the hallway. The corridor was dim, lit by strips of neon that cast everything in pale blue. My shoes echoed softly against the tile, each step unsteady but determined. I passed closed doors, rooms where machines beeped and whispered, where other families sat vigil. My hand clenched the strap of my bag, knuckles white. At the end of the hall, the double doors waited, painted off-white and chipped from years of use. I paused, glancing back once at the nurse's station where Marissa looked up and caught my eye. She gave me a small nod, almost like a blessing, and I managed the faintest smile in return. Then I pushed the door open. The cool night air hit me first, sharp and damp, carrying the smell of asphalt still wet from rain. I stepped onto the pavement, my body shivering from more than just the temperature. The fluorescent lights above the entrance buzzed faintly, throwing long shadows across the empty lot. For a moment I stood there, the weight of the bag on my shoulder, the ache of stitches tugging against my skin, my letters sealed away behind me. I listened to the quiet, no familiar voice calling out my name, no parents waiting with open arms. Only silence. I tightened my grip on the strap and walked forward. Each step carried me farther from the bed that had held me, farther from the chair that had remained empty, farther from the idea that I would ever be chosen by them. Behind me, the automatic doors closed with a hiss. The sound was final, like a chapter slamming shut. I didn't turn back. The old world, the one where I waited for their approval, ended with that sound. What lay ahead was uncertain, but at least it was mine. A week later, they finally showed up. By then, I was gone, miles away from the place where I had left my blood, my tears, and that letter. I only heard later from Marissa what happened when Linda and Richard Donovan walked into St. Lay's, Helena with Alyssa trailing behind them. They came through the automatic doors like they were checking into an office, not a hospital where their daughter had nearly died. No rush, no panic, just the shuffle of footsteps on polished tile. Marissa told me later she had been standing at the desk when they asked for me, their voices clipped as if it was an inconvenience that I wasn't waiting where they expected. She explained calmly that I had been discharged days earlier. Their faces, she said, did not crack with surprise or relief. They simply nodded as though she had confirmed an appointment they were late to. Richard adjusted his watch, Linda pressed her lips together, and Alyssa rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. Then Marissa reached into the drawer where I had placed the folded paper. She slid the envelope across the counter, her hands steady, and told them I had left something behind. Linda's fingers trembled as she picked it up. Richard stood behind her with his jaw clenched tight, the muscle twitching. Alyssa leaned against the counter, arms crossed, impatient. Linda opened the letter. The words stared back at her in the same ink I'd pressed through the paper, the same words that had burned in me as I wrote them. She read silently at first, then her face crumpled. A sound escaped her, thin and broken, a gasp that turned into sobs. She pressed the letter to her chest as if that could change its meaning. Richard did not speak. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. For once there was no lecture, no defense, no attempt to reason it away. He simply stood there, hands hanging at his sides, as if the weight of the paper in Linda's grip dragged him down too. Alyssa scoffed, her voice sharp against the hush of the corridor. She said I was being dramatic, that I always liked to play the victim. Her tone was flat dismissive, the same tone she had used when I was 10 and crying because she got a birthday cake of her own while I blew out candles from the side. Marissa didn't flinch. She looked Alyssa in the eye and said quietly, almost like a truth meant for the air, more than for them, that when someone leaves this quiet, they are not coming back. Her words hung there heavier than the hum of the fluorescent lights. The silence that followed was not the kind that begs to be filled. It was thick, suffocating. Linda sniffled into the paper. Richard stayed rooted in place, and Alyssa shifted uncomfortably but offered nothing more. One by one, they turned toward the exit. No one raised their head as they walked back down the corridor. Linda kept the letter clutched against her like it might dissolve if she let go. Richard's footsteps dragged. Alyssa pulled out her phone, her eyes fixed on the glow of the screen instead of the walls that had held the proof of their neglect. Marissa told me she watched them pass through the same doors I had walked out of, but in them there was no resolve, only the hollow echo of people stripped of excuses. They moved as if carrying something they could never set down. Outside, the parking lot was bright under the morning sun, the asphalt steaming from last night's rain. Their car sat waiting, spotless, polished, like everything in their world was meant to look better than it really was. They climbed in without a word. The engine started, the car pulled away, and that was the last the hospital staff ever saw of them. For me, knowing this later, the image stuck in my mind. My parents and my sister walking out of that building, not with me, not with hope, but with a folded piece of paper that told them exactly who they had been. They left in silence because silence was all they had left. And for the first time, it was not mine to carry. I moved into a small attic apartment above a used bookstore called Second Chapter Books in downtown Columbus. The place smelled faintly of paper and dust, but it felt safe, tucked away above shelves that carried stories older than me. The ceiling slanted, the paint peeled in some corners, and the windows rattled when trucks passed on the street below. None of it mattered. It was mine. The landlord, Mrs. Keller, was a widow in her 70s with kind eyes and a way of minding her own business. She handed me the keys without prying into why a 21-year-old girl looked like she had walked out of a war zone. She only said that rent was due on the 1st of each month, and that if I wanted to pick up hours in the shop, she could use an extra pair of hands. So I did. I started stacking books, wiping shelves, and working the old register that always rang too loudly. Customers came and went, most of them regulars who knew Mrs. Keller by name. At first, I kept my head down, spoke as little as possible, and let the rhythm of the place carry me. It felt like a hiding spot wrapped in hardcovers and quiet. But even hiding places cannot keep the world out. One afternoon, while I was arranging paperbacks near the front table, a woman browsing asked about the scar along my jaw. Her question was casual, curious, not cruel. For a moment my throat tightened, but then I smiled faintly and told her it was just a reminder that I survived. She nodded, and we both let the silence close back around us. It was the first time I had said those words out loud, and they stayed with me long after she left. I began attending a support group for trauma survivors at a community center a few blocks away. The first evening I walked in, my palms were damp, my chest tight. Folding chairs circled the room, and strangers sat with downcast eyes, each carrying their own invisible weight. When it was my turn to speak, I froze. My voice caught, and before I could stop myself, tears spilled down my face. Words tumbled out, broken and halting, about the accident, the hospital, and the silence of the people who were supposed to love me. I expected judgment, but none came. Only nods, soft murmurs of understanding, and tissues passed gently into my hands. That night, I walked back to the bookstore lighter, not because my pain had lessened, but because it had finally been seen. Life began to take on small patterns. In the mornings, I opened the shop with Mrs. Keller, who always brewed coffee strong enough to keep me awake until noon. She never asked about the scars or why I sometimes flinched at sudden noises. She simply offered quiet companionship, and sometimes that was all I needed. There were still nights when the crash replayed in my dreams, when I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding like the moment the car spun across the highway. But in the daylight, I started building a world that belonged to me. I learned which shelves creaked, which customers would talk for hours, and how sunlight fell across the counter at different times of day. I also learned that survival was not just about breathing. It was about choosing how to live after everything had been stripped away. For me, it meant saying no to the Donovan name, no to the weight of their neglect, no to the false hope that one day they might choose me. One evening while closing the shop, I paused at the window overlooking the street. People hurried below, some laughing, some frowning, each of them heading toward lives I would never know. For once, I did not feel left out. I felt like I had stepped into my own lane at last. The letter I had left at the hospital had been my ending with them. The key Mrs. Keller had placed in my palm was my beginning with myself. I held on to that distinction every time doubt crept in. It was not a grand life, not yet. It was a narrow bed in an attic, the steady hum of a bookstore, and the soft applause of strangers who understood pain. But it was mine, and in its smallness I found something I had never known before. I no longer needed the Donovan family to measure my worth. My existence, fragile as it felt, was enough. At the end of September, my parents hosted a family gathering at my aunt's house in Worthington. I was not invited, of course, but word always found its way back to me. Cousin Danielle, who never tiptoed around anything, asked them in front of everyone where I was. She said she had heard about the accident on I-70 and that I had almost died. The room fell quiet for a moment. Linda smoothed her blouse and said that I needed space, that I had chosen to step back from the family. Richard nodded along, his jaw tight, and Alyssa rolled her eyes like it was just another drama I had created. But Danielle did not look convinced. Neither did half the cousins sitting around the dining table with their plates of casserole and iced tea. Later that week, I heard from another relative that the conversation had sparked whispers. People wanted to know why my parents had not been at the hospital. Families in Columbus talk, especially when the Donovans had always presented themselves as polished, responsible, picture-perfect. Once cracks appeared, they spread quickly. I would have stayed out of it if not for what happened next. A portion of my hospital files somehow slipped out. Maybe a careless staff member, maybe someone who thought the truth needed light. Either way, a page circulated online in a local Facebook group. The words were plain in black and white. Parents notified, declined visit, reason dog care. The comments came in fast. People who had known us since childhood could not believe it. Neighbors who once admired my mother's charity work and my father's coaching at Little League now wondered aloud how parents could choose a pet over their own daughter's life. Some defended them, saying it had to be a misunderstanding, but the doubt had already sunk in. I sat in the bookstore one evening scrolling through the posts. My hands trembled as I read the phrases. Parents chose a dog over their daughter. What kind of mother does that? How could anyone sit at home with a golden retriever while their child lay in the ICU? For years, my parents had guarded their image carefully. They dressed sharp for church, volunteered at food drives, posed for family photos with bright smiles. I had been a silent prop in those pictures, never the favorite but always present to make the frame look full. Now those frames began to crack, not because of anything I said, but because truth has a way of leaking out. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part ached. This was still my family, the people whose names were on my birth certificate, and to see their reputation unravel in public was strange and painful. Yet I could not forget the cold hospital nights, the empty chair, the line of ink that said they had chosen Daisy over me. At a Sunday dinner that month, one of Richard's colleagues asked him directly in front of others if the rumors were true. My father reportedly stiffened and said it was a private family matter. But in small towns and suburbs, nothing stays private for long. Even Mrs. Keller mentioned it one afternoon as she wiped down the counter. She said she had seen people talking about my parents on Facebook and asked if I was all right hearing it. I told her I was fine, though the truth was more complicated. Fine was not the right word. It was more like I was watching the ground tilt under people who once towered above me. The Donovans had always cared more about what neighbors thought than about what I felt. Now the neighbors were the ones raising their eyebrows. The irony was not lost on me. I folded laundry that night in my attic room and thought about the words my cousin had dared to ask at that gathering. "Where's Claire? Didn't she almost die?" A simple question that my parents had no honest answer for. That question had opened the first crack. The leaked record widened it. and the whispers filling living rooms and online groups pried it further apart. By October, the Donovan name no longer shone as it once did. Smiles in church pews felt tighter. Invitations to social clubs grew fewer. I was not there to see it, but I heard enough to know. And for the first time, I did not feel the weight of shame pressing on me. The shame was finally shifting to where it belonged. The image they had worked so hard to maintain was splintering, and nothing they did could glue it back together. Alyssa's perfect facade had always been her shield, polished and gleaming under the spotlight she demanded. She treated Instagram like a stage, carefully arranging every detail from the angle of her wine glass to the tilt of her head. People once believed it all, swallowing her stories of family bliss and effortless charm. But the tide had turned, and I saw the proof in every screenshot passed along by neighbors and distant cousins. Her latest post was supposed to be harmless, just another photo of her in a crisp white dress standing outside a boutique in downtown Columbus. But beneath it, the comments piled up like wreckage. "You left your sister to die," one person wrote. "How can you smile knowing what you did?" another asked. Hundreds followed, sharp words that pierced through the filters and editing. At first, Alyssa fired back in the only way she knew how, by doubling down. She posted even more frequently, filling her feed with designer shoes and brunch spreads, pretending the noise was just jealousy. But the more she tried to smother the truth under curated images, the louder the truth became. Then the blow landed. A national fashion brand that had partnered with her for nearly 2 years released a formal statement. The words were everywhere, shared in articles and reposted on feeds. "We cannot align ourselves with someone who abandoned her sister in critical condition for a dog walk. Effective immediately, all contracts are terminated." The Donovan family dinner table must have gone silent when they saw it. For Alyssa, who had built her entire identity around being admired, it was a strike to the heart. But instead of reflecting, she searched for a villain. That villain was me. I heard about her anger first from Danielle, my cousin, who texted me late one evening. "Brace yourself," she wrote. "Alyssa is blaming you for everything. She says you leaked the records." I stared at the words sitting on the narrow mattress in my attic apartment above the bookstore. The walls were close, the air heavy with the smell of old paper drifting up through the floorboards. For a long time, I didn't reply, because part of me already knew. The next night, the call came. Her number lit up on my cracked phone screen, one I hadn't deleted, even though I should have. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice was frantic, stripped of the smooth confidence she usually wore like lipstick. "You think this is justice, Claire? You're laughing at me, aren't you? You wanted this." I stayed quiet. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I lost a contract worth more than you'll ever see in your life. My reputation, my career, all ruined because of you." Finally, I let myself speak, my voice lower than hers, steadier. "I didn't need to ruin you, Alyssa. You managed that all on your own." Her breath hitched. For a second, I thought she might apologize or at least falter. But then she snapped, spitting words like venom. "You've always been jealous, Claire, and now you're dangerous." The line went dead, but her accusation lingered. Dangerous. The following morning, she posted a long story filled with glittery fonts and carefully posed selfies. In it, she claimed to be the victim of lies, said people were jealous of her success, hinted at betrayal from within the family. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she meant. The comments didn't forgive her. They turned sharper, pointing out her evasions. Screenshots of the hospital records circled again, alongside whispers from the Facebook moms group where someone had shared my discharge note. The truth could not be buried under pastel colors and pretty captions. Meanwhile, I continued shelving books at Second Chapter, helping customers find novels for their teenagers, sipping coffee with Mrs. Keller after closing. On the surface, my life was small, almost invisible. But every day I carried with me the knowledge that the scales were finally tipping. I did not rejoice in Alyssa's downfall, not exactly. The girl who once lived in my shadow was learning what it felt like to stand in one, and I could almost pity her if I didn't remember the nights I begged for care and was denied. For the first time, Alyssa was being judged, not by me but by the world she had courted so eagerly. And for the first time, she was found lacking. I sat on the attic floor one night, the rain tapping against the window, and thought about how fragile her kingdom had been. Built on applause, it had collapsed the moment the clapping stopped. This wasn't revenge, not yet, it was consequence. And it was only beginning. I opened my laptop late one night, the attic quiet except for the creak of old pipes and the hum of the bookstore's heater below me. The cursor blinked on an empty page, and for once I didn't try to silence it. My hands trembled, but I began to type. The words poured out jagged and raw. I called it The Night They Didn't Show Up. I wrote about headlights slicing through rain, the sound of steel screaming, and waking up in a hospital bed with a tube down my throat. I described the whisper I overheard in the hall, the way my parents chose Alyssa's dog over me. I didn't name them. I didn't need to. The story wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about survival. When I hit publish, it was under an anonymous handle. No photo, no location, just a story thrown into the void. I expected it to vanish like everything I had once said in that house, swallowed by silence. Instead, it began to ripple. At first, it was only a few comments on the blog itself. Someone wrote, "I thought I was the only one who had parents like that." Another said, "I cried reading this because it feels like my childhood." I checked the page the next morning and the view count had tripled. By the weekend, someone had shared it in a Columbus support group. A local blogger reposted sections with the caption, "Sometimes the ones who should protect you walk away." Within a week, the piece had traveled far beyond Ohio. I saw screenshots on Twitter, fragments posted on Facebook with thousands of likes. The words I had typed in the attic were now echoing in places I had never been. One night, Mrs. Keller brought me tea upstairs and said gently, "There's something you need to see." She handed me her phone. A regional news site had run an article, anonymous blog post about parental abandonment in Columbus goes viral. I stared at the screen, my throat tight. They didn't know it was me, but the world suddenly knew my pain. Emails began to arrive in the inbox attached to the blog. Most were short, just a line or two. "Thank you for writing this. I thought I was alone. You put into words what I never could." Some were longer, filled with stories of people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten by the very families meant to love them. I read each one slowly, letting their words settle into me like a balm. And then came the message that stopped me. It was from a woman named Emily Hayes in Nebraska. She wrote that she had been struggling, that her parents had minimized her existence for years, and that she had thought about ending her life the night before. Then she found my story. She ended with, "Reading your story saved me." I sat frozen, my hands hovering above the keyboard. Saved me. The phrase echoed louder than the monitors had in the ICU. I thought about that hospital room, the vacant chair beside my bed, the whispered words about a dog. I had survived without them, and now somehow, in telling the truth, I had helped someone else survive too. The tears came suddenly, spilling hot and unstoppable down my cheeks. Not because of sorrow this time, but because for the first time I felt the weight of my voice. It wasn't just the story of what they had done to me. It was a bridge to strangers who carried their own wounds. I wrote back to Emily. I told her she was not invisible, that her pain was real and it mattered. I told her survival was enough, even if it felt small. I signed it simply. From someone who understands. After that, I kept writing. Each week I posted a new entry, sometimes about the accident, sometimes about the years of being overlooked, sometimes about healing in small, messy steps. Each one found its way into the hands of more readers. The comments filled with voices that had been quiet too long. At the bookstore, I noticed customers who lingered longer, who glanced at me with recognition. I wondered if they had read the words and connected the scars on my face to the story. No one said anything outright, but there was a new gentleness in the way some of them smiled. One afternoon, a man with a kind face pointed at the scar on my forehead as I handed him his receipt. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" I took a breath and smiled faintly. "Just a reminder that I survived." His eyes softened. "That's enough," he said. That night, I opened the inbox again. Hundreds of unread messages waited, but I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt steady. Each one was proof that my story mattered, that silence could be broken. The Donovans had once decided my worth was less than the family dog. But strangers across the country were telling me I was more than enough. And in their voices, I finally began to believe it myself. News of the lawsuit reached me before I even saw it in the papers. A woman from my support group mentioned it in passing. "Did you hear?" she asked, eyes wide. "Your parents are suing St. Helena." I laughed at first, a short, sharp sound that startled even me. It felt absurd, but when I got home and opened the local news site, there it was in bold letters. Donovan family files lawsuit against St. Helena Hospital for breach of privacy. My stomach turned. They were really doing it. They were trying to erase the truth by dragging the hospital into court. The article said Linda and Richard Donovan claimed their private information had been leaked unlawfully, resulting in damage to their reputation. They painted themselves as victims, as if the hospital had invented the words that were written in their own hands. I wanted to close the page and walk away, but I couldn't. I read every detail, every date, every phrase until the screen blurred. They were asking for damages, for an apology, for the hospital to be punished. Not once did it mention me. Not once did it acknowledge that the so-called breach of privacy was my life. When the court date was announced, it was everywhere. Columbus Monthly covered it. Local radio shows debated whether hospitals should be held responsible for leaks. Strangers argued in comment sections, some defending my parents, most shaking their heads. The morning of the hearing, I sat in the back row of Franklin County Courthouse. I wore plain clothes, hair tied back, and kept my eyes low. I wasn't there to be seen, but I couldn't stay away. The Donovans arrived together, polished and practiced. Linda in a navy dress suit, Richard in a tailored gray jacket, Alyssa in oversized sunglasses, though it was cloudy outside. They looked like a family going to church, not people about to face the weight of their own decisions. The hospital's attorney, Michael Green, rose first. He was calm, silver-haired, his voice even. He spoke about medical confidentiality, about procedures, about the hospital's strict adherence to privacy. And then he said quietly, "We will present the internal logs that show the plaintiffs were notified at the time of their daughter's accident and that they declined to come." I felt the room shift. The judge leaned forward. Reporters' pens scratched across paper. The Donovan's lawyer, a sharp young man named Howard Blake, immediately objected. He claimed the hospital had fabricated entries, that clerical errors were common, that no responsible parent would ever refuse to be with their child. He painted Linda as a devoted mother, unfairly maligned by gossip. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as if on cue. Richard kept his jaw tight, staring straight ahead. Alyssa shifted in her seat, restless. Then Green lifted a stack of papers and walked them to the clerk. "These are the originals," he said. "Stamped, timed, and signed electronically." He read from the page slowly so no one could miss it. "Parents notified at 10:14 p.m. Parents declined visit. Reason given: dog care." The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, no one breathed. I pressed my nails into my palms. There it was, the same line I had read alone in the hospital bed. But now it was no longer a secret in a folder. It was public record. Blake stood quickly, voice rising. "This cannot be taken at face value. Anyone could have written that in error. My clients never said such a thing." But Green stayed calm. The log was generated automatically by the nurse's electronic charting system. Each entry tied to a badge ID. This one was Nurse Marissa Clark's. He paused. "She will testify if necessary." A murmur ran through the courtroom. I caught the faintest flicker of recognition on Linda's face. She knew Marissa. She knew it wasn't a mistake. The judge adjusted her glasses and asked if the plaintiffs wished to contest the authenticity of the document. Blake shifted, glanced at my parents, then muttered that they would reserve the right to question it later. Reporters in the front row scribbled furiously. One even whispered, "That's going to make headlines tonight." I sat frozen, the air thick around me. They had dragged the hospital into this fight, hoping to rewrite the narrative. Instead, the truth was louder than their performance. The very words they had tried to bury were now read aloud under oath. Linda kept her tissue pressed to her eyes, but her shoulders were stiff, her tears controlled. Richard's face turned a dull red. Alyssa leaned over to whisper something, and Linda shook her head sharply, silencing her. The judge called a recess and the room buzzed with chatter. Reporters filed out quickly to call their editors. I stayed seated, my hands gripping the bench. For the first time, the weight of proof wasn't mine alone. When the Donovans stood to leave, people turned in their seats to watch them. No one smiled. No one offered sympathy. They walked down the aisle in silence, their polished image cracking with every step. I didn't move until the room emptied. The pages of that log stayed in my mind, the line burned deep. Parents notified. Declined visit. Reason dog care. It was undeniable now, and the world had heard it. Judge Harold Simmons adjusted the papers on his desk, his hand lingering over one in particular. The courtroom had settled into a hush after the recess reporters poised with pens ready, my parents stiff in their seats. I knew something was coming even before he spoke. The judge cleared his throat and said he would now enter into record a document found in the patient's hospital file written in her own hand. He looked over his glasses toward my parents. This is your daughter's letter left the night before her discharge. The air shifted. I felt my pulse rise as if it were me on that stand, though I sat tucked in the back row. Judge Simmons unfolded the sheet and began to read aloud. His voice was calm but firm, each word carrying the weight of law. I am writing this so there is no confusion, the letter began. You did not come. You did not call. I survived because strangers held my hand when I could not hold my own. The room stilled as the words traveled through it. No coughs, no shuffling of feet, not even the clicking of reporters' pens. The judge continued. You chose the dog over my life. That is not love. That is abandonment. From this night forward, I release myself from you. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. A low sound broke from her throat, half sob, half protest. Richard's shoulders sagged forward, his head bowed so low I could barely see his face. Alyssa sat rigid, her chin tucked down as though if she looked up she might meet the eyes of everyone staring at her. I had written those words with shaking hands, my body weak, my spirit raw. I remembered the cold hospital pen, the way the ink smeared when my hand trembled. Now, those same words filled the walls of a courtroom and pressed against the polished veneer my family had spent a lifetime maintaining. Judge Simmons read the last line with deliberate care. You will not see me again. You forfeited that right the night you left me alone. He set the paper down and let the silence hang. It felt like an eternity, every second louder than the last. For the first time, the truth was not just mine to carry. It was spoken aloud, entered into record, undeniable. My family's shame had no curtains to hide behind. Linda began to cry, harder, shoulders heaving, though I couldn't tell if it was guilt or humiliation. Richard rubbed his forehead as if the words themselves were too heavy to bear. Alyssa muttered something under her breath, but the microphone caught enough for people to hear. She's being dramatic. The words snapped through the silence, brittle and sharp. Several heads turned toward her, disbelieving. Even the judge's eyes narrowed before he banged the gavel once for order. Attorney Green rose slowly, voice steady. Your Honor, this letter speaks for itself. It is not speculation. It is not gossip. It is the testimony of the person most harmed, written in real time, preserved in her medical file. The community has the right to know where the truth lies. Reporters' pens flew again, the scratching sound filling the air like insects buzzing. I sat perfectly still, though, inside me a storm swirled. I had not planned for this, had not dreamed my private words would ever be read aloud in such a place. Yet, as I listened, I felt no urge to take them back. They were my truth, and the world had needed to hear them. The judge let out a slow breath. The record is clear. Whatever reputational damage has occurred is not the result of hospital negligence but of choices made by the plaintiffs themselves. I saw Richard flinch. Linda leaned heavily against him, whispering something I could not catch. Alyssa pressed her lips so tightly together they turned white. The gavel struck again, sharp and final. Recess is over. Proceedings will continue tomorrow. Court is adjourned. People began to rise, but the hush remained. It was as if no one wanted to break the fragile gravity that letter had left hanging in the air. I rose too, my legs unsteady. As I stepped toward the exit, I passed close enough to hear a reporter murmur. That letter will be on every front page by morning. My parents did not turn toward me. Not once. They stared straight ahead, locked in their own collapse. Outside the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions at anyone with the name Donovan attached to them. I slipped into the background, moving quickly toward the side street, the cool air biting at my skin. My words, once scribbled in a lonely hospital room, had become something larger than me. They had cut through the silence my family depended on and forced the truth into daylight. For the first time, I understood that I didn't have to stand in front of them to be heard. My voice was alive, echoing without me. I kept walking, my heart still unsteady, knowing the fight was far from over, but feeling for the first time that it was no longer mine alone to wage. A year later, I stood behind a black curtain at the Greater Columbus Convention Center, palms warm against a stack of note cards I would never use. The air smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. Volunteers moved like quiet birds, headsets pressed to their ears, waving speakers forward when it was time. I watched rows of chairs fill with people who had traveled from across the country for a trauma survivors conference. Some came with therapists and friends, some came alone, all of them carrying stories I would never fully know. My chest lifted and fell in slow counts. I had learned to breathe again, and this was one more proof. When they called my name, I walked into the light. It was softer than I expected, warm on my face. The stage swallowed footsteps, and the microphone picked up the hush of the room. I looked out and saw notebooks, open hands clasped, a sea of faces that did not look away. I thanked them for being here, then set the note cards down because I did not need them. Everything I had to say was already written inside me. I told them about the rain and the highway, about waking up inside bright white walls with my body held together by thread and tape. I told them about silence heavier than pain. I told them that sometimes the deepest cut is not in flesh but in the place where you should have been safe. I spoke slowly, not to dramatize it but to honor it. I wanted each word to land and then leave room for breath. I told them what I heard in the hallway that night. Parents notified, declined visit, reason dog care. Some people gasped. Others closed their eyes. No one laughed and no one shifted in their seat like I was asking for too much. The acceptance in that room steadied my knees. I talked about the small apartment above the bookstore and the way healing had come like morning light, thin at first and then bolder. I told them about the support group that passed me tissues and listened like it was a sacred task. I told them about writing in the middle of the night and the first email that said, "Reading your story saved me." I did not give those moments to the people who abandoned me. I gave them to the strangers who stayed. I did not spend long on the lawsuit, only enough to close the loop. Months after that day in court, the judge dismissed my parents' claim. The record stood. The hospital was cleared. My letter became part of the public file, and I made peace with that. Truth can be a lantern when it is finally allowed to burn. I could feel the room waiting for something more, something clear enough to carry home. I gave them the sentence that had carried me. They did not show up when I was dying, so they do not get to show up now that I am living. The words left my mouth clean and simple. No anger. Just the boundary that saved my life. Silence fell, not empty or cold but full. Then the sound rose. It was not a roar, it was a steady swell of hands and breath and quiet. Yes, people stood. Some wiped their faces, some pressed palms to their hearts. I felt the tremble in my own chest and let it pass through me. The applause faded into a hum and then into quiet again. I thanked them and stepped away from the mic. Backstage smelled like dust and warm metal. A volunteer with kind eyes handed me a bottle of water. Speakers passed by with quick congratulations. I slipped down a side hallway where the carpet changed color and the noise dulled. My phone buzzed with messages from the group, from Mrs. Keller, from readers I had never met. I did not open them yet. I wanted to sit with the moment before it scattered into pixels. In the lobby, people waited in a loose circle, a small signing table I had not asked for tucked beside a potted plant. I took my seat and listened as they shared pieces of their lives. A woman in a red sweater said her sister had not spoken to her in 6 years. A man with gray at his temples said he told no one about the night he was left at the ER. A teenager came with her aunt and squeezed my hand like it might keep her from floating away. I gave each of them what I could, a look that did not turn away, a sentence that said, "You are not alone." I saw her before she spoke. Alyssa stood near a column smaller than I remembered, without the bright colors and the glossy hair. Her hands twisted together. She stepped forward when the line-thinned eyes flicking to the people around us and then back to me. For a heartbeat, I was back in our old living room watching her at the center while I orbited in quiet circles. Then the image slipped. She said she wanted to talk. She said she was sorry. She said the word like it could be a key. Her voice was soft, careful, carrying just enough pain to sound real. I listened without rescuing. She told me she had not realized how bad it was that night. She said she thought I would be fine. She said people make mistakes and sometimes those mistakes are loud. I let the words fill the space between us. I thought about the hospital bed, the empty chair, the months when she watched the internet break open under her. I did not hate her. I also did not owe her the version of me who would smooth it all over. I told her the only truth that mattered. You knew, you just did not care. I said it without heat. It was not a knife. It was a door closing. She flinched like the sound itself had weight. She started to say something else and then stopped. For a second, I saw the little girl in the tutu and the gleam of a cake that had my candles and her name. Then I looked at the woman in front of me and saw someone who would have to learn to live without my forgiveness. She nodded once, then turned and walked away. No cameras, no string music. Just footsteps fading and the soft murmur of strangers who had witnessed an ending that did not belong to them. I stayed until the line was gone. I hugged the last person and then gathered my things. Outside the convention center, the sky stretched clear, a bright Ohio blue washed clean by a morning breeze. The city sounded like itself again, cars and crosswalk beeps and the low hum of voices. I stood on the steps and felt the sun find my face. It did not feel like a finish line. It felt like a road I had chosen on my own 2 feet. I thought of Mrs. Keller saving me a seat behind the counter and the way the bookstore doorbell chimed whenever people looking for second chances walked in. I thought of the support group and the circle of chairs where we practiced telling the truth without apologizing for it. I thought of the readers who sent me their stories and trusted me to hold them gently. I thought of the girl in the ICU who made a vow with stitches pulling at her skin. She had kept it. I walked toward the street, not fast, not in a rush to outrun anything. The past was loud, but it was behind me. Ahead there was a modest apartment, the scent of paper and dust, a stack of blank pages, and a life that fit in my own hands. I felt the weight of it and did not flinch. I carried it gladly. If you have ever had to choose yourself over a family that made you small, if you have ever walked out of a room in quiet and did not look back, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments so others can find the courage they need. If this journey spoke to you, stay with this channel, like the video so it reaches someone who needs it, and subscribe so we can keep telling the truths that help us heal.